Thank you, Mr. Grimsley, and all the panelists for your stimulating thoughts on the future of counter-UAS technologies and policy. It is now my pleasure to introduce our second panel of the morning, the Climate Security Panel, moderated by Dr. Renee McPherson. Dr. McPherson is an associate professor of geography and environmental sustainability at the University of Oklahoma and director of the South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. Dr. McPherson holds a Bachelor of Science degree in mathematics and a bachelor's, master's, and PhD in meteorology. She is the recipient of the Charles E. Anderson Award from the American Meteorological Society for her extraordinary and sustained efforts to broaden participation of traditionally unrepresented individuals in STEM research and education, particularly women and Native Americans. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Renee McPherson.
Thank you. And I welcome our distinguished panel today. We're going to I'll briefly introduce them and give them some time for opening remarks, and then we'll go to our questions. So first, Dr. Berrien Moore is the Dean of the College of Atmospheric and Geographic Sciences at the University of Oklahoma, Chesapeake Energy Corporation Chair in Climate Studies, and Director of the National Weather Center. He researches global carbon cycle, remote sensing, environmental and space policy, and mathematics. He leads NASA's second Earth Venture mission called the Geostationary Carbon Cycle Observatory, or GeoCarb. He earned his PhD in mathematics from the University of Virginia. And for his lifelong dedication to science, Dr. Moore has been recognized with the NASA Distinguished Public Service Medal and the NOAA Administrator's Recognition Award. He is an elected fellow of the American Meteorological Society and the International Academy of Astronautics. He contributed to the award of the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Dr. Moore?
Well, thank you, and I'm delighted to be here. When you talk about climate, it's been my experience that one must be very clear about what we know, what we think we know, and what we don't know. These tend to get confused. What we know for sure is that carbon dioxide and methane are greenhouse gases, which is a good thing. If we didn't have greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we would have a very cold planet. Space is big and we are small. We know that CO2 and methane are greenhouse gases, and we know from ice core data and atmospheric measurements that CO2 has increased in the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution about 50%, and methane has tripled. We know that CO2 is a very long-lived gas in the atmosphere. Methane is not a long-lived gas in the atmosphere, but molecule for molecule, it is a much more powerful greenhouse gas. So these are things we know for sure. There's one final thing we know for sure, and that is stabilizing the concentration of greenhouse gases, particularly CO2. The burning of fossil fuels is at the heart of almost all societies, and CO2 is a very long-lived gas in the atmosphere. To stabilize it, you'd have to cut emissions by about 90%. What do we think we know? We think we know that the planet is warming. We think we know that if you warm the planet, you will evaporate more water, and therefore you will rain more water. These have profound implications. What we don't know is how this might change severe weather and storms. But what we think we know is enough to say we have a significant problem that is already baked into the planet. It is baked into the planet. And therefore, from a national security point of view, we best pay attention. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Erin Sikorsky is the director of the Center for Climate and Security and the International Military Council on Climate and Security. She has been deputy director of the Strategic Futures Group on the National Intelligence Council, where she co-authored the Quadrennial Global Trends Report and led the intelligence community's environmental and climate security analysis. She is founding chair of the Climate Security Advisory Council, a congressionally mandated group that facilitates coordination between the intelligence community and government scientific agencies. Her Master's of International Affairs is from Columbia University, and as an adjunct professor at George Mason University, Ms. Sikorsky is also a visiting fellow at the University of Pennsylvania's Perry Worldhouse and serves on the advisory board of the Smith College Center for Environment, Ecological Design, and Sustainability. Ms. Sikorsky.
Great. Thank you, Renee, and thanks for having me here. I'm a Big Ten girl by birth and at heart, but it's nice to be at the University of Oklahoma in the Big 12. What I thought I'd do in my opening remarks is just take what Dr. Moore has given us and give some practical examples of what this is meaning, what climate change and extreme weather events mean for the U.S. military and national security. And we're already seeing these effects on military installations, on readiness, and military operations. In 2018, Tyndall Air Force Base on the Gulf Coast was decimated by Hurricane Michael. Planes were destroyed. Every single building on the base sustained damage in some level. Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, the year later, in 2019, flooded. The airfields there, secure, compartmented facilities were flooded. It was a mess and a disaster. And there's more of these coming down the road. In addition, our soldiers, their missions are changing. Right? Here in the US, the National Guard is now fighting fires in a much longer fire season every year. About 5 years ago, the National Guard spent about 14,000 man-hours fighting fires. They're up to almost 200,000 man-hours now. It's not just the National Guard, it's also active duty military forces that are involved in these missions. And it's happening outside of our borders as well. The good news that I think we'll talk about on the panel today is that there's real opportunity here for the US military, for the innovation we're here to talk about, to get ahead and address some of these risks, right? There are no regrets policies, right? That even if climate change isn't as bad as we think it's going to be, there are things we can do that will be good for the US military and US national security that will help make our military more resilient, will help keep our soldiers safer, and we'll be able to help our allies and partners around the world that we rely on be there when we need them. Last night at the reception, Representative Tom Cole spoke very eloquently about the need for allies and partners in the face of the geopolitical moment we're in right now with competition with China and with Russia. Many of those allies and partners are on the front lines of some of these climate threats and will face them, especially in the Indo-Pacific, much sooner than we will here in the United States. And what we can do in the US to help those allies and partners build that resilience will pay dividends down the road for us. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation and focusing on those opportunities and innovations going forward.
Thank you. And Commander Andrea Cameron is a permanent military professor in the National Security Affairs Department at the US Naval War College and founding director of the Climate and Human Security Group. She also teaches on foreign policy, climate change, and national security. Her academic interests explore non-traditional and transnational security threats and their impact on US strategic national security and economic interests. Commander Cameron holds a doctorate in education from Pepperdine University in educational technology and a PhD in security studies from the Naval Postgraduate School. She currently is a Fulbright Scholar Awardee in NATO Security Studies in Belgium. Commander Cameron will be teaching climate security at the College of Europe and researching climate security policy development in NATO and NATO member states. Commander.
Thank you so much. So let me first say that anything I say today is my own thoughts and not representative of the US government. I'm not here in my official capacity. Thank you for including me in this wonderful conversation. We talked this morning, especially starting with the keynote, of both technology lag and innovation lag and policy lag, which was really important to be brought up. So for one example, China did their first white paper on climate change in 2008. So if you do some math of 2021, when our significant thought about climate and security was implemented, we have about a 14-year lag in thinking about the connection between climate and our own national security. So I'd like to really kind of put that forward. I'm going to take some of the geopolitical stuff that Erin works on and put it more in the DoD context. We've talked a lot about innovation, and there's a lot of points of failure for any of these types of systems that we'll be talking about all day today. And any one of those points of failure is where we have a vulnerability and a weakness. And when you incorporate climate change and the changing operational environment, it can affect our people in that operational environment, any one of the points of systems within any of those pieces of technology that we're working with. And I'll go ahead and conclude there because I know you want to put a lot of effort on your Q&A.
Thank you. And Commander, we'll start with you on the Q&A. We know that we've already been seeing the impacts of climate change today on DoD physical assets, supply chains, and human resources. From your expertise working with the Navy, what do you expect them to do to prepare for battlefield operations as these impacts increase in frequency or intensity during the next 10 to 20 years?
Well, anytime you're talking about climate, you're talking two different pieces, mitigation and adaptation. So one thing we want to do is mitigate our own carbon footprint for a variety of reasons. But from a DoD perspective, it's really important because we want to be less dependent on certain sources of operational energy, and therefore we are less vulnerable in the field of battle. From the adaptation side, if I had a concern, it would be that, in a future battle, the adversary has done what they need to do to adapt their systems to the changing environment, and we lag. And that ends up in a situation we don't want to be in. So those are the two prongs that we generally look at.
Thank you. Ms. Sikorsky, so all branches of the U.S. military have plans to address climate change. What elements of these plans do you think are most important to address in the next 10 to 20 years? And are there any key elements that are missing?
Sure. So as you said, all three of the services in the past year have released strategies for managing climate change. Army was first, Air Force was last, but maybe they saved the best for last, I'm not sure. Certainly the Air Force has the hardest job in some ways of the three services on the mitigation, the cutting emission side in particular. And there are a lot of similarities between the three plans. They all track largely with what overall DoD has proposed, moving to 100% carbon-free electricity by 2030, moving all non-tactical vehicles to be electric by 2035. But there are differences in the plan as well as you would expect based on the particulars of each service. The Army is very focused on installations and microgrids on every installation, on energy resilience on those installations, energy efficiency. And the Army's actually proposed to be fully electric in its tactical vehicles by 2050, which I would say is pretty ambitious. But it's good to see that ambition because I think not only does that help the military, but it also helps drive the larger private sector, right, the larger economy as well. You asked what is missing from these plans. I think, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, is I think the balance between mitigation and cutting emissions and adaptation is a little off. There's a lot of focus on the mitigation side, which is absolutely critical to avoid catastrophic security effects in the second half of the century. But as Dr. Moore mentioned, there's a lot of warming already baked into the system, that even if you cut all emissions tomorrow, that you're still stuck in a warming world that's going to change how our troops have to operate, the kinds of wars our troops might be involved in, right? The kinds of security threats we face. And I would say each of these service plans don't address that issue quite as much, and they need to do a better job of that. And the problem is it's not just about the military then, it's about whole of government, right? And addressing some of these adaptation challenges because it's not going to be the military's responsibility to deal with all of these adaptation issues that are needed in our national security policy. It's also the State Department, it's USAID, it's other Department of Homeland Security, right? So DoD can't do it alone, but I would encourage more focus on the adaptation side of things.
Thank you. So all of these actions really require a lot of technological expertise as well as human intelligence. Dr. Moore, if we look at just the next 10 to 20 years, what are some of the elements of either climate adaptation or mitigation that are technically feasible now and can have really large scale and positive impacts for the US military?
On the mitigation, I want to pick up on what Dr. Lewis said, and that is biofuels. But there are two elements of the biofuels that need to be recognized. First of all, turning food into fuel is stupid. I mean, that is just an idiotic thing to do. That's purely political. What we really need to do is to look at the net energy gain in the biofuels so that we make sure that we're positive and we're not pumping more energy into the system than we're getting out. The second on mitigation, I may be stretching what we can actually do today, but you gave me 10 to 20 years. So green hydrogen, no question about it. Green hydrogen is something we really should be beginning to think about. On the adaptation, I think that we need to emphasize mobile and highly efficient water purification systems to be deployed around the world. Drought is going to be a significant driver on strategic action. The second thing that I would think that is most important is to improve our capabilities on sub-seasonal to seasonal forecasting. Climate is no longer a stationary time series. We've perturbed it. Being able to look out sub-seasonally, seasonally, maybe a year out is terribly important. But that's going to require better observational systems, particularly buoys, oceanic drones, as well as atmospheric drones. Every U.S. flagged ship should be required to have a weather station on it. So I think the only way to really push the sub-seasonal to seasonal is more data.
Can I pick up on that?
Please, please.
So more data, I think, is absolutely critical, and then having the workforce in place who knows what to do with that data
Very good point.
is even more so. And I know coming out of the U.S. intelligence community, the amount of employees that had the scientific literacy and the data literacy to be able to take this information and integrate it with security policy, it was a pretty small group of people. And I think building that bench, right, and that's why I think the universities like yours are so important, so we build that national security workforce that has the skills to do what's needed to be done with this information.
Thank you. Yes.
I had a separate follow-up. The governor mentioned the strength of the energy policy in Oklahoma, and it's so diversified. And we don't do ourselves any service as a military force by substituting one energy dependence on solely one other energy dependence. So it's important to think more broadly about the energy diversification as we move forward.
So that leads me into thinking about the DoD budget. So half of our discretionary budget, or about half, goes to DoD, and they partner with so many people. So kind of that budget emphasis that the DoD can bring can not only transform the U.S. military, but actually can transform our U.S. society. So let me start with you, Ms. Sikorsky. Can you talk a little bit more about where that kind of power behind the dollar can help, especially in terms of mitigation efforts?
Sure. And I think, we heard a little bit about this in the discussions this morning. I think, on the one hand, sometimes you see statistics about the U.S. Department of Defense and how its emissions are so great, and if you compared it to a few countries in Europe, right, it's much larger than those countries, but still as a part of the federal, as a part of overall U.S. emissions, DoD is still very small comparatively. So I think the role that DoD can play is pushing on that innovation. It's pushing on market demand. It's especially on the non-tactical electric vehicles, for example. By putting that as a goal, that sends a signal to the private sector, right, that DoD is there, they're gonna be wanting to buy these vehicles, and I think that helps drive the market in a useful way beyond just the amount of money that DoD will be spending. I think the innovation and the research into hydrogen and other innovative technologies is really helpful as well as a kind of a test bed. The last thing I'll say here too is I think the communities in which U.S. military bases operate, because of these goals around moving to non-carbon or carbon-free electricity, if those bases plug into the local grid in the community, that can drive change in that economy and that community there in a very positive way. That's useful. So it's not just about the base, it's about the overall community. It also means that if those communities have already moved to carbon-free electricity, DoD doesn't have to do anything to change, to meet the goals other than plug in. We see this in Washington State with some bases there already. So I think thinking through those synergies is really useful.
And just as a follow-up to that, what about carbon capture and storage technologies? Is that something that DoD has been thinking about?
Well, it's clearly a very important topic, and I think to the extent that we could make the problem a little easier, you ought to convert every single coal-fired power plant into natural gas. I mean, that's just, burning coal ought to be criminal. It's crazy. So if you could cut the emissions by your fuel choice, and then it's very tough on the carbon capture and storage, but it's going to require energy in. But if you could utilize episodically renewables, that may be a way to help on the energy budget where you could capture the carbon. I personally think that's a tougher problem than the green hydrogen.
Thank you. If I can continue on some of the technologies, I know remote sensing technologies have been really helpful in terms of adaptation, and particularly helpful, as we've seen with Hurricane Ian, with rescue and recovery operations. Military obviously uses remote sensing technologies to gather intelligence and conduct defensive operations, oversee personnel safety. How might these technologies kind of move into the future, Dr. Moore, to help the DoD with this effort?
I'm going to speak selfishly for a moment. I am the PI on a Geocarb mission. It's to put a satellite that measures CO2, methane, concentrations in the atmosphere from geostationary orbit over the Americas. We need 3 more. One over Singapore, one over the Indian Ocean, and one on the Grand Meridian. Because we actually need to be able to trust but verify. And mitigation is going to require a verification step. The second thing I think is that, as I indicated, I think this perturbation, this change of the hydrologic cycle is going to be huge. We need to know about soil moisture on the planet everywhere. That requires active remote sensing. I think the DoD really needs to help us implement such a system. And finally, just to go back to that subseasonal seasonal forecasting, we really need to know about changes in El Nino, La Nina. That requires observations, particularly oceanic observations, drones, buoys, and so forth. The worrisome thing is that most climate models show that in a future climate we'll have more El Nino than La Ninas. That's a drying and a burning of the planet. That's worrisome.
Thank you. Commander Cameron, technology's great, but people are behind all of this. So if we can turn a little bit toward education, the U.S. military already requires extraordinary training for its personnel. Can you talk about some of the aspects of how training is changing or needs to transform in a warming world?
That's an excellent question. The biggest thing that has probably impacted is Black Flag Days, the extreme heat that kind of sends, a lot of our training and operations is outdoors, and it sends people indoors during the time when we want to be outside during the workday. So one of our shifts is kind of moving things earlier or planning our academic calendars around the seasons, because we just have kind of inhospitable times where it's unlikely to get the productivity you need out of certain training events. And other things we've considered, which COVID kind of advanced, is kind of hybrid models of training, what needs to be done in person, when, along which types of timelines, and how can you successfully still achieve mission and have your force with all of the training it needs, but do it in a different way.
What about the kind of climate knowledge of the personnel? Is this an area where people on the ground need to know more about climate, or do we keep it at senior levels of the U.S. military? What do you?
This is something we're wrestling with, not just our military, but other militaries who are starting to look at climate and security together. It's a huge debate. Do we need it at the top level so that they understand the geopolitical implications? There's kind of a mantra in climate, all climate is local. The people who experience climate change here in Oklahoma are different than the people in the Naval War College in Rhode Island. We're looking at different things. However, you need to understand the operational impact of whatever it is in whatever area you're in, and able to continue your mission as you need to. A couple different approaches to climate literacy. One, a top-down approach, inform the leaders, and it kind of comes through to the force. A bottom-up approach, which is happening a little bit naturally because a lot of the younger generation in general knows more about climate issues, and that's starting to feed up. And the UK is taking an interesting middle approach, where they kind of are targeting people like myself, maybe 10, 15 years in service. They're the leaders of, the next, the flag ranks, et cetera. And so they're kind of taking that middle approach to training about climate and climate impacts.
Can I build on that a little bit? First of all, Commander Cameron is a real leader in the U.S. military on these topics. So you guys are lucky to have her here today because she's leading this educational effort in ways that's really innovative. So huge kudos to you, Andrea, for that. I think another way that the education needs to happen is more experiential for folks, right? You can have online modules, you can have folks sit in classrooms, but I think with climate especially, tabletop exercises, wargaming, where you bring that climate element in and folks can see how it affects their actual job. If you're a logistician, for example, how is this going to affect moving things from point A to point B? And the combatant commands, actually, I believe in the next year, will all be hosting climate-focused wargames in their AORs to really get at that experience piece of things, which I think is a huge step forward. What I think would be even more impressive is if they brought climate into their existing war games, right? So it's not a climate special war game, but it's whatever you normally war game, but now you layer climate impacts, what we expect maybe 10, 20 years down the road, and see how that changes things. I think that can really help with the education piece a lot.
Thank you. And working off of that, some of these climate change impacts we're seeing today, but some of them, like opening of the Arctic, is out into the future, but certainly it's something that the U.S. military is thinking about. What do you think are some of the key areas strategically that are going to be affected by the impacts of climate change that really need to be honed in on at this time?
I'm happy to start, but then I'd be interested. I think, as you mentioned, the Arctic is key. And I think when you're layering the climatic changes there with the geopolitical challenges we have there now, it's a very dangerous moment because you don't have a lot of opportunity for good dialogue about the changing amount of commercial and military activity up there. I'm worried a lot about the Indo-Pacific as well, not only because of the changes to the Pacific Islands, which is an existential threat, obviously, but also in the Mekong Delta and the other shared river basins there between India and China. I think there's a lot of opportunity for increasing risk as things change in those river basins and tensions ratchet up between the countries. The last thing I would say is I think China itself I'm particularly worried about. China faces a lot of climate threats to its own land and territory that could create real challenges for the government there, for supply chains writ large. I mean, we've seen what COVID has done to interrupt supply chains there, and I think the US needs to spend some time thinking about what happens if you have major climate disasters in China that get out of control of the government, and what that means for conflict and risk. So that's another place. I mean, frankly, you spin a globe, you put your finger down. I can tell you a story of security risk in that geography, but I'm sure these guys have other thoughts.
So I'll pick up where Erin left off, because naturally a lot of people sometimes just conflate climate with Arctic. But it is a global perspective that we need to take on it. The places I generally think about is Southcom, the Geographic Southern Command, and AFRICOM are two areas where they almost virtually equate climate security with their own national security for a variety of reasons. And as I think through how the climate is going to affect the DoD, we might be drawn into new areas where we have not operated previously. And our strategic interests might change, especially with the energy transition from fossil fuels into the rare earth elements. So all of those pieces might change US national interests, and therefore pull us as a country and as a DoD into operating into different and difficult conditions.
Dr. Moore, any additions to those?
I don't think so. I'll go to the other one that we want to talk about, feedbacks.
Okay, so
That's what I really want to think about.
so it's on the tip of his tongue, so to speak. We want to talk a little bit about tipping points. So we know that the Earth system does have the potential to transition from one relatively stable state to another if the atmosphere warms too much. So what is the tipping point that you think the DoD should be most concerned about?
Kind of come close to it. That's the Arctic. And more generally, it's the role of the oceans in the carbon cycle. The CO2 that we put in the atmosphere, about 45% stays in the atmosphere. About 30% goes into the terrestrial biosphere net, and about 25% goes into the ocean. But the ocean has some feedbacks that are very worrisome. You warm up the ocean, the skin temperature of the ocean, you decrease the solubility of CO2. You put CO2 in the ocean, there's a declining pH. A declining pH decreases the solubility of CO2 in the ocean. You take a bright object like the Arctic sea ice in the summertime and you turn it into a dark object like open seawater, you increase the feedback loop. Warming then leads to sea level rise. Sea level rise poses its own direct effects. But it's the role of the ocean in this global carbon cycle, and particularly these ideas that many of the feedback loops on the ocean side of the equation amplify. They increase the longevity of CO2 in the atmosphere. That is really worrisome.
I can give a more tangible. So we had the first national intelligence estimate on climate change released in 2021. They listed 3 particular tipping points. One was the Arctic, one is the Antarctic, and the other is the collapsing Gulf Stream up the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. So those are kind of 3. There are broader ones that are in the IPCC reports, but those are 3 key ones that came out of our own national intelligence estimate.
And if I can follow on that, I think one of the reasons it's so important to understand these is because all of our national security policies and defense policies are rooted in assumptions about how the world works, right? I mean, that's how we all operate. We have assumptions that allow us to get through our day. And climate change and these tipping points throw those assumptions out the window, right? So it forces us to rethink how we plan and question those assumptions. Again, and this can be at the very tactical level. You know, my first job as an intelligence analyst was looking at conflict and extremism in East Africa, and we had a lot of assumptions about when fighting happened and when insurgents would fight based on when the rainy season was, right? The rainy season doesn't exist the same way it used to in East Africa now. You can't predict when the rains will come or how intense they will be, so your understanding of when the bad guys are going to fight or not fight, you need to change your assumptions there. And that's just a small example of all sorts of things that these climate changes will mean for planning.
Commander.
And to close it out on a more optimistic, there's not just negative
Yes,
tipping points,
yes.
there's optimistic tipping points. Like if we have a rapid technological development on carbon capture or any number of different things, you can hit a rapid tipping point that helps in favor of the kind of Earth system.
Thank you for ending on a positive note there. Some people call me Dr. Doom. So let's turn to the audience for some questions. If you can keep your questions to just a few sentences, we can cover as many as possible. And then please introduce yourself.
All right, thank you. Thank you. That was really enlightening and a great panel. Thank you all so much. I'll introduce myself, Tomás Díaz de la Rubia, the Vice President for Research and Partnerships at the university. We didn't talk about pandemics. This was a climate change panel. However, there is a relationship between evolving climate and future pandemics. In fact, I was just reading an article about melting ice in the Arctic, in Greenland, potentially leading to new viruses and bacteria coming back into the Earth system that have been frozen for thousands of years. Can you comment a little bit on the impact of the intersection of climate change and pandemics on U.S. national security and our position?
Ms. Sikorsky, you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, I think I read that same article, and it was one of those where you're like, oh, this is starting my day off on a cheery note. I think, you know, as temperatures warm too, that changes zoonotic diseases, right, and where pathogens can exist. You also have the human-animal interface in more regions. As migration happens due to climate change, you have growing cities. And so all of these pose security risks to the U.S. as well, as we've seen with the COVID-19 pandemic, and can threaten governments, right? Threaten instability in countries, or because of existing instability can spill over to other places. I think for DoD, one thing that's good to think about is a lot of the ways you build resilience to climate threats also help you with pandemic threats, right? Thinking systemically about these risks, thinking about actorless, so-called actorless risks that can cross borders, needing different tools. So there's co-benefits to dealing with both, but certainly climate change amplifies the risks of pandemic in a way that is particularly concerning.
Commander?
And if you think of our number one mission, it's defend the homeland.
Right.
So I'm less concerned about the permafrost in this case, but maybe more mosquito-borne viruses that are coming up from the south, and insects that don't get killed off during the winters because our winters aren't so cold. So all of our bases, all of our personnel, and our communities are equally vulnerable to those types of things. And you saw how disruptive COVID could be. So it's entirely possible that we need to think through more what are the health implications, public health implications of that type of migration as well.
Yes, thank you. Question? Yes.
Hi, I'm Tristan Winkle. I'm a PhD student in the political science department. It's just sort of like a little bit of a market-based and economic security and instability question is with the increased demand for electric, we're going to inevitably move from big oil to big mining, which can be a tough sell. How can the United States balance climate concerns towards mining here at home and develop these resources here, but also assist other countries from falling victim to the resource trap?
Dr. Moore, do you want to try that one?
I think that, once again, to use a phrase that has been mentioned many times today, system of systems is the way you have to look at the whole area of energy. And we're going to have to, as I indicate, we're going to have to migrate from the use of coal, which was the fuel of the Industrial Revolution, away from coal to natural gas, and then use natural gas as the bridging fuel. But this bridging is not going to happen overnight, and therefore we need to understand very clearly how to move towards the hydrogen economy, but extend the use of natural gas to as simply try to slow down the rate at which CO2 is increasing the atmosphere. The second element of that I think we're going to have to start thinking about is, are there negative emission strategies, like afforestation on a very large scale, reforestation on a very large scale, Actually, you could use biofuels because you could, if you use industrial labor, industrial wood, I mean, this wood in this floor is going to take a long time to oxidize relative to how fast the tree will regrow. So there are energy land use strategies that migrate carbon from the atmosphere to the terrestrial landscape through industrial processes. This all needs to get pulled together in an overall system of systems strategy.
Sir?
I think, first of all, my name is Mohammed Khalil. I'm with Oak Ridge National Lab. So you talked about some trade-offs, and one of them, you mentioned some beautiful statement about shifting from fossil fuel to rare earth elements. Right? I think a lot of us don't think about that. Right? And again, when you're trying to electrify vehicles or electrify whatever, magnets, whatever in renewables, you need rare earth elements. And unfortunately, a lot of these mines are not in our hands and we don't control them. So that, I think, it creates a big issue. And I'd like to hear from you a little bit about, you mentioned about some security implications, potential wars, and so on. The other point, the trade-off, is really the trade-off between renewable energy sources and climate change. So in a lot of ways, we think the silver bullet is in renewables, right? But if climate change is real, which I believe, we all believe it's real, right? When I site a windmill here 20 years down the road, I may not have a lot of wind, I may not have a lot of solar. Just take the Colorado River with hydro, right? With 3 dams, very little electricity now, right? And again, when we talk about green hydrogen, well, you're not going to be able to desalinate, seawater. You need to, do electrolysis on seawater. You need to desalinate seawater first and then do the electrolysis and so on. So these are challenges, and we have to think them a little bit more, like you said, in a system of systems. So what are your thoughts about these two trade-offs from a security point of view?
Commander Cameron, do you want to start with?
So one thing that has been emerging in the last couple of years is this element of strategic competition with China, particularly about rare earth elements. That started in the Trump administration, has really carried forward in the Biden administration, because they have the preponderance of the mines and almost all of the processing capability. What we're trying to do is work with internally and with allies and partners to develop that, because we know it's such a strategic edge, especially as not just our country, but every country around the world is facing the same problem and trying to figure out how to diversify and transition their energy sources. That gets back to what I said earlier about where are U.S. international interests, and those interests in different places around the globe may change. In general, if you think about away from fossil fuels, outside of the Middle East and into other areas, particularly potentially Africa. So those are some of my initial thoughts to answer your question.
Ms. Sikorsky, anything to add?
On your second part of your question about how you may not have wind or water where you expect to have it, right? I'm particularly concerned in places like Brazil, right, where they get 70% of their energy right now from hydropower. And as the water change in those rivers due to climate change, that's going to be a huge challenge for them. I think that's why using forecasting and planning around where we expect some of these changes to be, being able to do better forecasting, more precise forecasting is really important. I mean, I don't know how many articles you read about climate-driven disasters where they say, well, our sewer systems were based on 200-year-old, maps of where we thought the water would be. And so making those changes, especially at a local level, and getting the data to the local folks to make the right decisions is critical, but that's a huge undertaking and really, really challenging, but we needed to start yesterday.
One quick comment, and you were right at the edge of it. I think on the green hydrogen, one of the strategies would be to use wind and solar to essentially separate the oxygen from the hydrogen, and then use the hydrogen as essentially a stored renewable. So that you're using the renewables, because the problem is the episodic nature of the renewables, wind and solar. So use hydrogen manufactured by renewables becomes a renewable, but it's now a stored renewable. It's a lot better than batteries.
And one last question.
Good morning, Ryan Stoddard, Rose State College. Question for you about maybe the reverse of all this, which is I've heard very little about nuclear power today. And even Freakonomics just recently did a podcast about why isn't anyone talking about nuclear. My perhaps dated knowledge is the U.S. Navy is the biggest operator of nuclear reactors in the world. And how do we export that comfort and understanding of nuclear power from the DoD back to the civilian world for power generation? Is it worthwhile? Do you think it's even possible? And could nuclear be part of our solution? Thank you.
Commander, do you want to, Dr. Moore will take this one.
Let's separate it into three pieces. One, the great big nuclear power plants. You're not going to get any energy company to do that. Two, there are power plant designs using fission at, say, a population of 250,000 people. I think that they haven't yet seen the economics of that, but we know the economics of the big plants are terrible. The final thing would be the light at the end of the goal at the end of the rainbow, and that is fusion. And there are major advances in the last 5 years in that arena. It's just, is it a bridge too far for the problems at hand? But clearly, if that progress is to be capitalized, we're going to have to look much more carefully at the capabilities of fusion.
One of our biggest
Please.
Go ahead, please.
takeaways from the Fukushima incident was the vulnerabilities. So many of the nuclear plants need cooling, which are either right on the coastlines or on the rivers, which are two very vulnerable places. So that makes it a very challenging large-scale infrastructure project to stand up. It's also very costly. I look at it from a manpower perspective. We lose all of our nuclear-trained officers because they get paid a lot more money to be at a power plant and they don't have to deploy under the ice cap anymore. But that won't be here anymore. So anyway, we're still losing people, that's the point. There is development, both large scale and small scale, that is being talked about because it is a diversification and an energy mix problem. However, the capital intensiveness, both of the materials, of the infrastructure, of the personnel, is really hard to replicate and hard to scale up with our partners and allies. So based on the perceived threat and then, the just vast expense, it's a pretty challenging piece of the energy mix.
Well, please join me in thanking our panel here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McPherson, and the esteemed panelists for sharing your insights on climate security and its impacts on national security. Ladies and gentlemen, it is time for lunch in the museum's Great Hall. We have a great little program scheduled for you. Congresswoman Stephanie Bice will be our speaker at lunch today. She is the Congresswoman from District 5 in Oklahoma. Thank you.